overview of teachings, I mentioned a few things and also in my Shabbat thought. So I hope you take a look at the Shabbat thought. I'll also put it online and put a link on my Facebook page. I only want to say one thing about what's going on is that the pushback that I hoped would happen, that we all hoped would happen, is actually occurring. I don't know if you saw the testimony in Congress. Congress is now officially concerned with the anti-Semitism, the calls for genocide on college campuses. My former colleague here in Los Angeles, Rabbi David Wolpe, who was on the Harvard Divinity School Anti-Semitism Committee, he quit the committee. He could not put his name on what they were doing. And in his resignation, he pointed out that's going on the campus is pure evil. He didn't blame the president, who says is a kind, good, decent person. He implicitly said, she's a terrible moral leader. For a person to say, we have free speech, but I know the degree to which language is monitored in universities. You can't say anything to bring any upset to any person, or you will be accused of harassment and aggression, and is purely in the subjective feeling of another person, except when it comes to Jews. We have to be so careful in those environments, and for some reason the Jews are accepted, and I think we know why. Other thing that's come out, and there's an article by Heather McDonald in the Wall Street Journal where she shows the institutions of diversity, equity, and inclusiveness foment anti-Semitism and anti-Israel behavior. It's a front. It's a very common Marxist technique to call something by what it is not, so that our minds are accepting, and then when we go deeper into it, there is a switch. If you read Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, an informative book, a book I really don't like, but I want to know what the game plan of the other side is. It is filled with deception, manipulation, and he justifies it by saying it's in the cause of a good thing. So Rules for Radicals basically says we don't have to be moral. We don't have to play by the rules because our goal is so right and so just that the rules don't apply to us. It's an interesting book. It's a fun book to read, but it's a little bit unnerving when you read it. Anyway, the pushback is happening. I've noticed the tone change in the New York Times. I've seen, although I do think the press provides terrible misinformation, terribly biased views. The pushback is beginning, and it's interesting for me to say, and I'm happy to say, the exact points that I've been making since October 7th, it seems like there is something of a cohesion, something of a consensus, that these are the exact points we all have to make. So there seems to be a common voice of people who are responding to this. Every Shabbat, we will talk a little bit more, certainly during the war. Every Shabbat, I want to talk more and more about our deep devotion to what I call the foundations of the liberal state, not as something we take for granted, but as something that has to be what I call a core part of our belief system. I'll give the briefest version now, and then I'll go to another topic tonight. Somebody asked me about Maimonides and Aristotle, and I thought, okay, I love to teach theology, even though I'm not a theologian, so I'll talk about that a bit tonight. So let me just rehearse the catechism. People have an existential choice to make, and I do think it's an existential choice. When you read the first few lines of our Declaration of Independence, do you believe in the so-called moral reality, the natural law, natural right, that there is some principle that oversees the human condition? We don't fabricate this principle. We live inside this principle of freedom, human dignity, the value of human life. So you cannot empirically prove it. You can't empirically disprove it. Once you believe that that's true, you know another thing, and that is our morals are not social constructs. Our morals are results of this, I'll call it a metaphysical principle. It's communicated to us through conscience. And people say to me, how do we know? We actually have a word for it. The faculty of the conscience is like the faculty of sight. You actually can know what the deepest moral principles are. Then, of course, at the political level, we create governments to protect our rights, human dignity, according to the Declaration. Our Constitution is a particularly good form of government is separation of powers, a regulated free market, not laissez-faire. To understand all this, you got to go back to Adam Smith and see how those theories developed into the industrial age. As I wrote in my Shabbat thought, clearly we have despicable parts of our past, but I believe that democracy is self-correcting. And so I believe that whenever we talk about the faults of the liberal state, we should first say how much we believe in the moral foundations of the liberal state, because when our children go off to college, they're put in the hands of people who hate the liberal state. They believe in Marxism, which means they want revolution and to overthrow they actually do. They hate the liberal state because the liberal state, in the opinion of the Marxists, ameliorates the human condition so you lose touch with the brutality of the ruling class and the oppressed. So remember, it's all run through the prism of the ruling class, the oppressed, colonialism, imperialism. History be damned. There's no way that you can actually demonstrate any of this. It's a theory. And they say the liberal state takes people off of being awakened to the truth of Marxist economic theory, Marxist political theory, Marxist moral theory, even Marxist metaphysics. So they hate the liberal state. And you probably have heard people say, we have to do away with it. It's so corrupt, but they never tell us what the next thing is. Somehow, when you get rid of the liberal state, we'll all just get together in some kind of communitarian fashion. There'll be a dictatorship of the proletariat. We're all going to work out, and it's all going to be beautiful. It's kind of a messianic theme, and it's deeply destructive and deeply untrue. My core recommendation I'm making over and over again, memorize this. There is a moral principle that is part of human nature. That's why we call it the natural law. If not, there are no real answers to moral questions. If a person asks me a moral question, for example, is it okay to butcher a baby if I feel like it? Now, am I referring to the mores of my society? Well, in Gaza with Hamas, I would refer to my mores, and it is perfectly permissible and maybe even obligated. I don't say, well, that's your culture. This is my culture. Who's to know? Now, that's what's happening. That's their culture. That's what they do when they feel oppressed. They feel licensed to butcher babies and butcher people. Right? We have to ask ourselves, do you really, really believe that the prohibition of butchering other human beings is culturally placed? Or is it always wrong in all places at all times? Now, I can't persuade you, but when young people come to me and say, can you demonstrate this is true? I say, can you demonstrate that it's not true? Of course, it's not demonstratable, it's metaphysical. And I say to these people, ask me, I say, it's an existential choice. Is human dignity, human freedom, human rights, is it true? We can't demonstrate it. We can't demonstrate that it's not true. So we have an existential choice to make. And I believe that everybody we talk to about this, they need to know that you have made the existential choice that you really do believe that human beings have rights and governments are constructed, at least in part, to protect those rights, the form of government, and of course, the history of liberal government. All right, that's the catechism I want us to memorize whenever we discuss these things. Know this by heart, believe in it passionately. Take the first 2 minutes of any discussion about politics or morality, make sure that people know that you believe this. And I don't think anybody who doesn't believe this is probably not here tonight. Everybody who's here tonight, I think, deeply believes this. We just have to rehearse it. And as I said at my Advocating for Israel class, we also have to rehearse the truth about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Most questions that people have are easily dismissed by somebody who actually just knows the history. Okay, that's my point there. Now to a larger point. At some point, I mentioned why I don't like the theologian Maimonides. I'm not sure how I got there. I could have tracked it down. I decided not to and spend my time and think about the answer. When we think about our belief systems, many people, when they think about theology, they go to our greatest theologian, Moses Maimonides. And I recommend that you don't read Maimonides. I recommend you know a little bit about Maimonides, just to be an educated person. But don't go to Maimonides for theology. You will regret it. Okay? And here's why. Maimonides is properly called a a philosopher in the Islamic world. Of course, he's not Muslim, but his philosophy fits perfectly within the milieu of Islamic philosophy. That's where we place him culturally and intellectually. There are issues that Muslim philosophers brought up ever since the 10th century. He lives from 1135 to 1204. And various schools of Islamic thought have been dealing with these essential problems. The essential problem is squaring Aristotle with Islam, or reason and revelation. I've studied this in English, and the questions get so carefully, at some point it loses touch with anything that we would consider real, because they keep going further and further and further to show, for example, the metaphysical nature of God, the oneness of God. For example, if we assume that God does not have space and therefore is of infinite magnitude, there can only be one being of infinite magnitude. I say, yeah, that's true, and it means nothing to me. I actually don't spend time on that. So now the question is, what about angels? And it all comes down to a study of physics and metaphysics. And Aristotle says you have to know that there's what he calls the prime mover, metaphysical being beyond all being, beyond reality, thinking about itself, and in some way moves reality into existence. And, I've read Aristotle, I think to myself, maybe true, but I don't care. I really don't care about the prime mover. I really don't care about the idea of how reality comes into being with a purely spiritual being, how a purely spiritual being connects with a physical world. What's the capillary action there? How exactly does the purely spiritual affect the material? Now, I've studied it. I think it's an interesting question. But if any person came to me with a spiritual problem, the spiritual quest, I wouldn't say, go study that. I'd say, go study something else. So the problem of squaring aspects of Aristotle with religion of revelation, I think is interesting. If you're interested in areas of the intellect, read about it a little bit. There are more pressing issues, I think, for human development. There's one other thing, again, that Aristotle teaches, that Maimonides and all of those who are influenced by Aristotelian thought, the confrontation of Islam and Aristotle, of Judaism and Aristotle, and Christianity and Aristotle, is what is the fully formed human being? Why are we here? What's our purpose? So from this perspective, remember, Aristotle thinks our purpose is teleological, meaning what's our end? So therefore, the acorn becomes the oak tree. So what is the fullest expression of the human being? What characterizes human beings, and what is our fullest expression? So Aristotle says what characterizes us uniquely is the ability to be rational, but then progressively more and more rational, where we know the mind of God. So what do you need to do? You have to master all sciences, mathematics, physics, as they knew it at their time, metaphysics, to the point where you can arrive at the mind of God, and you spend your time dwelling in the experience of your intellect meeting the divine intellect. Now, Maimonides admits, most people can't do that. Very few people can do it, but that is the ends, that's the proper ends of human nature. And I read it and I say, well, not for me. That doesn't describe what I think my proper ends as a human being is. I don't think for anybody here. So if you study Maimonides, it's going to give you very abstruse, and then you're going to look at Maimonides' theory of happiness is my intellect merging with the divine intellect. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know if that's what makes me happy. I mean, maybe, but it's never worked for me. The question is that's left with, then what is the purpose of the human being, if not cultivating yourself, mastering physics and metaphysics to the point that your mind can merge with the divine mind? If that's not our purpose, what is our purpose? I was asked that today. I did a podcast today with somebody. He said, what is the purpose? I said, I give my traditional 4-part answer. The 4-part answer came because our daughter Abigail was in France. She was learning how to do conversational French. She called me on WhatsApp. She says, Daddy, quick, what's the meaning of life? I'm in a classroom discussion. And so I had exactly 10 seconds to produce it. And I pulled it together and I said, do your duty. That's the core meaning of life. Every single moment of life where something's at stake, there's something you must do when there's something at stake. And you have to live your life in such a way that where you can understand what a situation is and what you must do that is spiritually true, that is morally true, and improves that little moment of the human condition. Find bliss when possible. We should enjoy our lives. Be resilient when you can't find bliss. You will have down, arid moments in your life where there's nothing coming in. You're doing your duty, but no one else is doing their duty. And you start to feel it's not fair, it's not right, I'm lonely, I can't handle this anymore. Why doesn't anybody else do their duty? My response is, it's not your question. Your question is, how do you do your duty when no one else is doing their duty? Because you're never relieved of the first question. And then I say, everything matters. The person said to me, what do you mean everything matters? I said, give me a case. And he gave me a Hasidic story where some Orthodox Jew is memorizing all the halachas on one issue or another. And the Hasidic rabbi says, why are you filling your mind with all these details that don't matter? Focus on the experience of God. And he said, do you think all these mindless details or the minutiae of halacha matter? I said, it mattered to that guy. How are we to judge what a person does that makes them fulfilled if they're not hurting anybody else? Now, if that person came to me and said, I spend all my time memorizing halakhic minutiae, I said, well, how are you with other people? Well, I'm kind, I'm generous, I have inner regulation, I have good character, and this kind of roots me. I said, right, no problem if you want to memorize halakhic minutiae. So I said, why does it matter? Because it makes this guy feel better. Because it compensates for the pain that he's carrying. He's decided that mastering halacha is something that makes him matter. And so I said to the interviewer, let's not be so judgmental of what matters to other people, because what really matters is the thriving of the human soul. And then we all find different ways to help our souls thrive. Do your duty, find bliss when possible, be resilient when you can't find bliss, and in general, know that everything matters, and we have to figure that out case by case. Of course, the deeper meaning and purpose of life that we haven't talked about for a while, I just want to make sure I say it for tonight, rests in a Kabbalistic worldview that I deeply believe in. Remember, I believe the human mind works metaphorically and symbolically. Language at its peak of human language is literary and poetic. Literature and poetry works with metaphors and symbols. It's the natural language of the soul. So when I express core metaphor of Kabbalah, of course, I'm not saying something literal, empirical. I'm talking about a mode of the soul. So the Kabbalistic myth is not verified by a reference to anything empirical. It's verified to the degree of meaning that the soul finds. Does it fill the soul with meaning? And does it impel you to be a person who self-regulates, has good character, and beyond and beyond and beyond all of that? So when I first studied the core Kabbalistic metaphor, what I noticed was it filled my soul. It taught me to strive toward human wholeness in every dimension of my life, and I have not exhausted it. So this is my metaphoric, the Kabbalistic, the Hasidic metaphoric statement of the meaning of human life. It's poetic, it's literary, it's metaphoric. We can't say it in language. All we have is poetry. So what is the poem? You all know this. The divine has gone through a shattering. It's called Hashvirah. Again, it sounds theologically impossible if you're a Maimonidean. How can a perfect metaphysical God undergo breakage? It's impossible in Maimonidean thought. But around the same time that Maimonides was living and writing, the Kabbalah came into being. So the Kabbalah uses metaphors not to try to understand the perfect metaphysical divine, but rather the breakage of the divine. And the question is for me, which metaphor for me more describes the human condition? the perfect divine with whom my intellect must merge, or my somehow experiencing divine sorrow, the divine disappointment, as you see in Genesis, first chapters of Genesis, that the whole thing has gone wrong. So we have the breakage of the divine, and the purpose of the human being, of course, is to repair the divine. So we call this the tikkun hakelim, the repair of the elements of the Kabbalistic tree of life is understood to be an expression of the divine mind. And as we commit ourselves to repairing the breakage of the divine, of course we bring repair to ourselves. And if we really mean it, we can detect the disrepair in our relationships. We can detect another person's work on repair. Maybe we can help them with some empathy and a little bit of well-timed wisdom. Maybe we can analyze society in this way. Once you understand this very well, you see that it actually describes just about every aspect of the human condition. So Rabbi Manning quoted a phrase that comes out of the German, man plans or man does and God laughs. I'm going to say it differently. I'm going to say God cries and we act. Right? We feel the divine tears. We feel the divine breakage. So from this perspective, it's not there's a perfect divine looking at our plans and laughing. I know it's a very common thought. We make plans and God laughs, meaning God says, I have another plan. And what the Kabbalah tells me is the divine is somehow broken. We human beings better have a plan, because that breakage is part of us. And if we're not fixing the breakage, right, the entropy just continues and continues. So from this perspective, we are not subject to the divine. The divine is subject to the work of human beings. For me, when I first studied it, it's an utterly humanistic message that dignifies the human condition, I think, in a completely unmatched way. As the great writer of Gnosticism said, Hans Jonas, he said, we create the lines on God's face. We create the lines on God's face. The grief lines, or do you want lines of joy? Of course, you think about the idea of the divine countenance. Enough on that. So when I think of Maimonides, again, brilliant. I love the intellectual pleasure of reading Islamic philosophy and Maimonides, but I don't agree with it fundamentally, because I have another faith system that fills with meaning and that I do believe in the sense of the metaphoric poetry brings truth to me. It's not empirically true, it's metaphorically, poetically true, and I've committed my life to the idea. Here's the last thing I want to say for tonight. Somebody mentioned to me that the Jewish people are known as the God wrestlers. You may have heard this from the story of Jacob and Esau, Jacob and the Ish, the anonymous person that I believe to be Esau. And Yisrael, which probably means God is my fighter, God is my champion, is playfully means Jacob contended with God. It was a wrestling match, so we are the God wrestlers. You've heard this before? I said to the person, yeah, so if we're God wrestlers, how many days a week do we train? Any wrestlers out there? Well, if you're a wrestler, you train. You just can't say, I'm a wrestler, and walk around and say, I'm a wrestler, because someone might say, oh, let's wrestle. So you better be a trained wrestler, or don't call yourself a wrestler. So I say, how many of these God wrestlers train in God wrestling? Do they show up to the mat 3 times a week and break their heart on it and sweat and get humiliated by the game? So people call themselves God wrestlers. I've met very few in my entire life. So they say, well, they wrestle with the question of belief in God. So whether it be an atheist or not, or an agnostic or not, they say, yeah. I said, how long does that match go on? You know, when I've met people that say, how do you know there is God and there's evil in the world? I'm an agnostic. It's about a 2-minute tape. The whole tape gets out. He says, is that all? So the whole question of God, you got a 2-minute tape that I don't say this, that I've heard 100 times. Everybody that has this question has the exact same tape. It's like they went to a seminar and they all had to memorize the tape. That's the tape. How can there be God when there is evil? There's no evidence for God. I don't believe in the Bible. Like, get it all out. There's about 2 minutes of it. Now, my question is that all the God wrestling you've done in your life? Is that 2-minute tape? So then you're not a God wrestler. So what are you wrestling with? So what we're wrestling with is, I say, so belief in God means nothing to you. That's okay with me. Do you believe in anything? Is there something that you believe in that means meaning to your life? that is transformative for you, that if you didn't believe it, you'd be a different human being. See, I think that's the test of belief. Do you believe something to be true without which you would not be you? That's your God. That's what you wrestle with. So that's why I don't want to dignify wrestling with belief in God as God wrestling. I would consider the metaphor of God is the deepest thing you know and believe in, without which you would not be you. And do you wrestle with that? All right, so those are my notes on a few notes on theology tonight. Another question I was asked is, who's this guy Jürgen Habermas and why do I love him so much? And someone wrote me and said, can you give the high school textbook version since you think he's so important? I think Habermas is so important that I actually would like to do this and put this in the catechism that we have to memorize when we talk to the questioning college sophomore. I'll simplify it. It's memorizable and it's powerful. And it so deeply accords with the Jewish understanding, very basically. Truth comes out in communicative discourse in the Talmud. When a Talmudic argument begins, the premise is that neither side knows what's true. Neither side knows the answer. Answers come from respectful, truthful, sincere engagement in communicative discourse. And Habermas has presented that like no other person. And one of the reasons I love it is because it so much reflects what I call Talmudic discourse. So I think we have to add to the contours of the liberal state that I think we should all believe in, know it like a catechism, teach it everywhere we know, make sure our children know it. And then there's what I call the theory of communicative discourse that I all think that we should deeply believe in and make sure we practice it. We should model it. We should teach it everywhere we go. It'll make things better everywhere if, I think, minimally, these two ideas, the moral foundation, the metaphysical foundation of the liberal state, everything that flows from that, including the self-correcting democratic state, and the ideas of Jürgen Habermas.